So what I'm going to share with you today, it's actually a work in progress. It's a will-be project more than anything, of which I have done some little pieces here and there, but I'm now trying to figure out how I can fund a much bigger, the much bigger picture, if you want. So much more ambitious data collection as well as theory development on governance by data infrastructure. So I'm going to share. So next slide, if you can. Thank you. So this slide, this advertising, huge, appeared at the Roma Fiumicino Airport in Italy in July 2021. It presented the possibility of boarding via biometrics, so with facial recognition technology for all Delta passengers. It's interesting. I mean, facial recognition technology is all around us, but it's very interesting because the way it was presented here wasn't a very sort of matter of fact perspective. They literally say it is not rocket science. It is your new way of traveling. You know, it's really all around us. Next slide, please. In fact, this is even like a screenshot from The Verge from 2017. To my understanding is that this project was then stalled, but not very far from Brussels or Amsterdam. There were a number of schools in Paris, but not only, across France, but also then in Sweden and other places within the European Union, experimenting with using facial recognition technology to find out when students aren't paying attention. Now, probably all of us in this room are also teachers, and well, we don't need facial recognition technology to see when students are checking their social media accounts in class. But, you know, it's interesting to see how, I mean, what was interesting, in fact, is that this software was volunteered, was shared for free with the schools in question by Cisco System, so the maker of the technology. And in China, it's not a big surprise that it's already going on, but I have to say that I was recently at the EduTech Europe, which is the European fair of education technology. It was hosted here in Amsterdam. That's why I ended up spending an entire day there, between creepy presentations, I have to say, and also mock-ups and you know, gadgets, giveaway sessions, and so on and so forth. All you can imagine from an industry fair, where, you know, there was Lego, for example, presenting how Lego toys, let's say, can be used to teach mathematics. But then literally what was the buzzwords there was emotion detection and, again, facial recognition. So essentially, this is the way ahead for schools across the world, not just, you know, in China, which we sort of are used to associate with maybe more authoritarian approaches, let's say. Next slide, please. Facial recognition technology works pretty much like in this manner. So this is a screenshot from 2020 article in The Guardian that presented the introduction, very critically, the introduction of facial recognition technology in the CCTV, so closed circuit television security system in the city of London. Now, these cameras, so facial recognition camera, had been installed across the city. If you're a Londoner and you just, you know, go around town, you are expected, or you can be reasonably expected to be caught on camera around 300 times in a regular day, right? 300 times. Now, some of these soft cameras are going to have facial recognition technology. This facial recognition technology, implemented by the London Metropolitan Police, has been found to have a very low accuracy rate. So there was a university that did an independent study, because of course the police figures were completely different, and they found out that only 19% of matches between you know, the basically facial features, so the distances that you see there in the dots, and existing databases. So the matches that basically identify a certain identity, a certain person from their facial features, only in 19% of cases they're accurate. So they really point to the right identity. 81 times the person who is identified is misidentified. Of course, this is a system that is implemented for security reasons. So, you know, it might happen to any of us passing by London to be misidentified as, let's say, a criminal, for example, because, as I said, the accuracy rate is still very low for this technology. The data are from 2020. Technology is advancing very fast, but the problem of accuracy still exists, especially for non-standard, let's say, facial features, non-standard form, for example, the London ideal citizen, which was white and male, right? So we can discuss that. I have a slide on that later, but this is the situation at the moment. Next slide, please. Yeah, we live in an increasingly datafied society that, where data are, a new currency. I mean, information has always been a currency of the state. It's not novelty. I mean, think about statistics, for example, on population as a way of getting to know the state, and therefore also as a way of ruling over the citizens. Now, of course, we are faced with an increasing amount of data that are generated also willingly by citizens themselves to, smart tracker, credit cards, smartphones, and you name it. So not only, tools of the state, but also tools of the citizens, which are literally actually tools of the industry. So we have an enormous quantity of data that can be used for leveraging, to know the citizenry, but also to make decisions about the citizens. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here comes my notion of regulatory data infrastructures. So all of this, so here you have an example actually from Belgium. It's the EU Digital COVID Certificate. I'm gonna, if we have time, I'm gonna say something about the EU Digital COVID Certificate later. But the EU Digital COVID Certificate is an example of what I've been calling regulatory data infrastructures. Facial recognition technology is another one. And there's more. Educational technology also are part of this class of technology, as are identity technology, digital identity technology. So what is regulatory data infrastructure? Well, you can understand, I don't need to explain this context what are data infrastructures. They are tools to, and large and small infrastructures in the sense that they involve, of course, like large data centers, but also smaller data generating devices like smartphones or certain software. And their peculiarity is that they acquire sort of regulatory function. They generate data in real time that results in monitoring of the polity and or decision making. So that's why they are regulatory. So they perform a sort of regulatory function. Next slide. And regulatory data infrastructure, to define them a little better, they generate data, as I just mentioned, that result in real-time monitoring or decision-making, and therefore they exercise regulatory power. What is interesting is that they increasingly take up functions that once pertain almost exclusively to governmental agency and public administrations. So we still have, of course, the welfare state or the public sector playing a big role, from the police to, agency that, for example, distribute public subsidies, but these are aided by regulatory data infrastructures, for example, algorithms or various types of software. And I contend that these are at the core of new, this is the new between brackets, inverted commas, sorry, is the new that, academics claim, right? But, it has been already there for a while, but I think now it has become more and more prominent. That's why it deserves our attention. So regulatory data infrastructure are really the engines of this new model governance that is boosted by the pandemic, governance by data infrastructure. Next slide. And regulatory data infrastructure, they're interesting because they are able to make and unmake publics. They are able to, for example, regulate access to the polity. This is the case of thermal cameras. They have made their appearance in Europe, but they already exist, across the world before, especially in Asian airports. And they are cameras that monitor incoming passengers into, for example, a given airport. But they appeared also, I don't know whether you have the chance to attend a festival or a conference or go to the stadium or to a concert during, the pandemic. We're still actually in pandemic times, I'll say, but less and less attention is paid to that. So let's say a couple of years ago, these were very, very common. They're still there, probably less used. But essentially, these cameras are facial recognition cameras, but for the most part, not exclusively. I mean, not all facial recognition camera, but especially they have the ability to track body temperature and single you out if your temperature is above a certain amount, right? Certain degrees. Sorry, just a second. Oh yeah, okay. Sorry, the baby is crying. I have a small baby and I had to call the father. So what is interesting with looking at the case of thermal cameras is that really they have the ability to admit someone to a given community and keep someone out in real time, right? Without involvement of particular agents with decision-making power. I went to a festival, a journalistic festival in Italy. I was very surprised to see that every time entering the main venue, but also smaller rooms, you had to go through something like this. Data were not recorded, that they kept saying, but you would be, if your temperature was about 37.5, you will be kicked out, or basically you will not be admitted. So it's an interesting example of how you can intervene into the making the polity in real time, bypassing, for example, security services that sometimes regulate access to, for example, a festival or a conference venue. So next slide, please. What are the problems with regulatory data infrastructures? Well, there are at least 7, but probably more. Well, a lot of the implementation, adoption of this technology happens outside democratic scrutiny. Think about, the pandemic times and what happened when, for example, COVID contact tracing apps were adopted. With a few examples, and I don't have the full-fledged picture of the world, but I have done some spot-on research in some countries. I can tell you that in Italy, for example, it was adopted. It was also very quickly abandoned because no one actually used it and it didn't work very well. But the parliament or any other citizen representative was not involved in the process of deciding how this app should look like, what data should be gathered, and stuff like that, right? So the adoption of this technology happens outside democratic scrutiny. Second, it involves for-profit contractors. So we have a prominent role played by the private sector. Now, once again, private sector has always played a role in the state machinery, or let's say more and more in the last maybe 30 to 40 years. But with this technology, the state simply doesn't have the ability to design, manage, and deliver. Therefore, they have to resort to standards and technologies created by Apple, Google, and you name it. For example, in the Netherlands, the only technology that the state designed is the digital identity technology, which is quite an interesting case. If I have time, I'm gonna say something about that later. But otherwise, other technologies are, bought basically by to public procurement. So you have a lot of state functions that get into the hands of private sector. Then all of this happens in a sort of gray social legal area. What do I mean by gray social legal area? For example, whereas there are provisions in national legislations about fingerprints, for example, which is a type of biometric, not the same can be said about other types of personal data. Or there are provisions like, for example, the GDPR level, but then maybe they don't necessarily apply to certain types of technology, like facial recognition technology, that in fact is now under the purview of the European Union. So we are basically, technology, as is often the case, is a little bit ahead, or very much ahead, regulation and legislation, and therefore, it's in a sort of area of where a lot of things can happen before, people in a way can protect themselves through legislation. Fourth reason for concern is the potential for discrimination. So the fact that, as I'm going to mention in a bit, essentially, this technology is often designed for standard human with an ideal citizen in mind, with an ideal user in mind, and it is known to discriminate against non-standard citizens. I'm going to say more in a minute. Fifth reason for concern is very difficult to opt out. Think a bit again about the pandemic. What happened if the school of your children all of a sudden said, hey, from tomorrow onwards, we're going to move online and you have to install Google Classroom or any other corporate setup? well, you can disagree with it, you can dislike it, but how can you actually opt out if you still want to ensure an education to your child, for example? But this is also the case of vaccination certificates when they were compulsory, like in the case of Italy, to even access the workplace. Then sixth reason for concern is the huge climate footprint that this type of technology has, although it's often presented as a problem solver rather than a reason for concern. It is expected that in a space of 2 years or 3 years, sorry, 1/5 of the world energy consumption is going to come from data center, 1/5, right? And this technology is also part of, as it mediates more and more our life, it's also part of the climate cost, let's say. And then the seventh reason is that once this technology is inserted into the society, is adopted, it quickly gets normalized and it doesn't shock us anymore. So technology, for example, adopted when privacy concerns were probably at their lowest during the pandemic, then becomes normalized and is seldom retired. Next slide, please. Yeah, I've used a lot of examples from the pandemic because I do believe that the pandemic has accelerated the transition to governance by data infrastructure. Just think, for example, about digital identity solution in the marketplace or in the industry. In the first 10 months of the pandemic alone, there was an increase of 72% in the adoption of digital identity system by shops online. Of course, to ensure, to prevent fraud and stuff like that, but you can understand, the impact it has on citizens' life. Countries like Canada also have started thinking about and piloting a digital identity system that they didn't have yet. So the pandemic served also as sort of test bed, but also it was a huge experiment also for technology company, but also for states and the public sector who basically saw a lot of public concerns decrease in a way, and a sort of thirst by the citizenry as well of techno solutions that were designed to curb the social cost of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Yeah, so governance by data infrastructure elevates regulatory data infrastructure to the preferred mode of governance of complexity. Now, of course, other modes of governance do not disappear, but I do believe that when there is a technological solution, the tendency today is to move over to algorithms, and in the belief that data probably know it better, but also that the move might overall cost less to the state. There's also the belief, which is always often badly, it is actually, wishful thinking, that data know it better in the sense that data are less biased than human decision makers, and that data are more, or data generating systems are more fair. Whereas we know, for example, from a recent Dutch scandal, an algorithm that was used to detect fraud in child welfare subsidies that was deliberately targeting citizens with double surname. So basically the new Dutch, right? So migrant background, citizens living in let's say low income neighborhoods, and citizens of another skin color. So, once again, who designs the algorithm then is biased maybe, but we tend to forget all of this. And as I already mentioned, this system of governance is characterized by the growing penetration of the private sector into state institutions, including, for example, the welfare system. I just mentioned an example. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I would like to briefly raise, I already raised like 7 reasons for concern. What happens when we adopt this technology with sort of with a blind eye? Well, I want to list other 3 reasons for concern. One is the tendency to techno-solutionism, which is based on something extremely negative when it comes to equality, because it produces discrimination. And it is the tendency to design this technology for the standard human. Here I refer to the work from the 80s onwards, 90s onwards, of a great US sociologist, Stephen Epstein, who wrote about the standard human, actually in a completely different context, not about the data-fied society, which were long to come, but about cure and solutions, so pharmacological solutions to or patches for HIV/AIDS. And the standard human, as defined it, is essentially, the ideal human that then, once identified, the solutions are designed for this human that happens to be, in the case of the DataFi society, happens to be male and white, because this is what data sets for algorithmic data generating system are trained on for the most part. But the standard human is used then as a stand-in for the rest of humanity and is used to make decisions for everyone else. So here we have essentially an exclusionary effect of these technologies, which are designed only for certain sectors of society. If you look, for example, the German contact tracing app called Luca, at the beginning, the first iteration was designed only for state-of-the-art smartphones. So if you had a non-very intelligent phone, of course, you couldn't run it because it's software that doesn't run in non-smartphone phones. But especially if you had a smartphone that was older than like 4 or 5 years, you couldn't even use the app. Let alone, of course, problems of literacy and age when it comes to this type of technology. So next slide, please. In a way, another byproduct of designing for the standard human is the legitimization on inequality and exclusion. So in the moment in which you design for only a certain sector of the population, or certainly the technology is not fit to cater to also this, the rest of the world, so to speak, you use software to legitimize decisions that deliberately exclude some portion of the polity, therefore legitimizing inequality and exclusion. Next slide. As also a byproduct of all of this, we see the rise of new forms of poverty, which we have called, we meaning myself and my colleague Emiliano Traref from Cardiff University, we have called it data poverty. We have seen it emerge in particular during the pandemic, when, for example, large portions of Africa at the inception of the pandemic didn't have the capacity of even testing for the virus. So only 2 countries out of 54 had the capacity of testing for the virus, which then led to very distorted reportings about, the racialized individuals essentially don't have COVID, which the COVID that would then lead to, for example, in Italy, to some, new episodes, unfortunately, of racism. But it also has to do with another form of data poverty, which is the fact that in times of need, like a pandemic, but not only, you really want to be visible to the state. And if you're not visible to the state, for example, because you're not visible through these type of technologies, but also in other situations, then you might not be taken into account when it comes to, distributing vaccines or distributing income subsidies if you cannot work. So data poverty, it's a bit of a longer story. I'll just leave it at that in the interest of time, but it's basically a condition of invisibility that is typical of increasingly data-fied society that stacks on top of other forms of inequality and poverty, of course, making it even worse. And next slide, please. Here, in the interest of time, I think I have to, maybe I have a few extra minutes to speak about this piece that is actually a very interdisciplinary reflection. It's one of the, what I mentioned, the building block of work that I've done on regulation by data infrastructure. It appeared in the European Journal Risk Regulation as part of a special issue. It's a commentary, in fact, so very, very easy read. And it's co-authored with Michael Veal, lawyer, Lynette Taylor, with critical data studies, development studies expert, and Cedar Gers, a computer scientist and security engineer. So, as you can see, very different perspectives that came together to take a critical look at digital vaccine and immune certification. And what we consider, so let me just to clear the air, none of us was actually against vaccines. We're not anti-vaxxers. We are all in favor of, getting immunized. What we raised concern about was this novel infrastructure for identification that in the case of the COVID vaccination certificate was mobilized for, promises something that in fact was hard to uphold from the scientific point of view, which is immunity, because as we know, the immunity that derives from vaccination, from having recovered from COVID is quite limited in time. And it's very difficult to exactly pin down how limited or how long it is for all of us or any of us. And so we have a number of concerns. One was that essentially this scaffolding, once it is in place, can then be used to nudge people behavior, but also it can be used to gather data for other purposes as well. An example which is actually not related to the COVID vaccine certificate, but to something similar, which is the Luca app, the COVID tracing app in Germany. Citizens were told data will be gathered only for the purposes of tracing virus diffusion. Later, it became known that Germany, one of probably the countries with highest concerns for privacy amongst the citizenry, well, data were shared also with security forces to track down crime. So we are worried about that. We were also worried on a sort of more global scale that vaccine certification legitimizes also inequalities between countries and people by formalizing ways to distinguish between the vaccinated and not vaccinated. So if you are an undocumented migrant, it's already nearly impossible without risking your life to get into Fortress Europe. Well, this immunity certification gives you even less chances in a way, because if you come from a country where, for example, you don't have access to vaccines, then this really decreases even your chances to being admitted. I guess in the interest of time, I leave it here. The article, as I said, is very short, makes a much more compelling case about why we're worried about this type of infrastructure. We should be worrying, we should be mobilizing. At the moment in Brussels, there is also a public consultation open about the digital identity wallet, which is a framework for digital identity that the European Commission wants to implement for all member states. They are talking about, for example, having add-ons, like, for example, not only your identity material, documents will be in there, also maybe your healthcare information, and staying immune vaccine certificate, but also your banking information. So probably likely to make our life easier, but also, again, creating this scaffolding that is particularly scary when it comes to data protection and freedom of movement. So I leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention. This is, as I said, just a work in progress, but something that I think deserves really an interdisciplinary perspective. So I look forward to maybe also cooperate with some of you on trying to understand better this new type of developments. Thank you very much.